Hello and welcome to my poster presentation, which is titled Changes in Functional Network Redundancy Over the Human Lifespan. This is poster number 1327 presented at OHBM 2020. I am Muhammad Usman Sadiq, the first author of this work, and I'm associated with the Biomedical Research Imaging Center, BRIC, at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I will also be available at my Jitsi chat group that is available at the data lab link. So let's get on to tell you about my work. So a bit of background of why this should be an interesting study for most of you is that there's been some research about um, and the variability of different brains in different subjects' brains in their reaction to disease. So, for example, in one of the studies, they found that many older adults who meet the pathological criteria of Alzheimer's, meaning they had the tau and amyloid beta, they did not exhibit any signs of cognitive worsening. So this showed that there might be a variability in the reaction of a given pathology within the brain itself. So to investigate much of the previous work that has been focused on this particular question has resulted in concepts of brain reserve and cognitive reserve, and you're welcome to read this first reference that details previous work about it. So what we want to do in this study is to see if functional network redundancy, which I'm going to define in a minute, is an appropriate substrate or an important substrate regarding the discussion of brain reserve. We wanted to investigate how functional network redundancy changes over human lifespan and whether or not it has a relationship with cognition. Functional network redundancy is basically just existence of alternate pathways in the functional network. So whether RY1 and RY5, for example, are connected by many indirect paths. So the more indirect paths you have between two ROIs, the higher is the redundancy. And the idea is that if two nodes have more indirect paths between them, it is very likely that they will continue to coordinate and correlate despite disruption, for example, in the case of pathology. So that is why redundancy we thought would be an important substrate. So a bit about what we did, we took data from the NCARE Rockland study. It is a fairly large data set, as many of you would be aware of. We used the anatomical MRI, functional MRI, sorry, in conjunction with the anatomical MRI. And we use that to extract the time series and correlation matrices and then the redundancy. Uh, we also measured use the cognitive data available. We used the Deleuze-Kaplan executive function system to evaluate whether functional redundancy had a relationship with the cognition or executive function. And we hypothesized that brain reserve, which has a putative dynamic shown in the figure 1A here, has some kind of resemblance with the proposed functional redundancy as a metric. So you can go into more details about methods and the processing pipeline, but I will leave that here in the poster and we can discuss it. But I'll go straight to the results. So results we found were very interesting in that the redundancy was found to be to follow the putative dynamic of brain reserve, and in that it has the same sort of accumulation till the ages of 60s, and where it starts dropping after the onset of cognitive decline. This this sort of upward and downward trend is pretty commonly known in the brain reserve, cognitive reserve discussion. And so we have shown that redundancy has a strong case for being an important neural substrate of brain reserve. We also showed that other graph metrics, for example, the clustering coefficient and degree in other graph metrics do not correlate with redundancy or do not capture this upward and downward trend of brain reserve. Hence, they do not constitute um, likely constitute brain reserve. So we do not have evidence of the idea that redundancy is just a combination of many other graph metrics. So in that sense, redundancy might be capturing an important graph feature that, for example, clustering coefficient, degree, and other uh, efficiency might not be capturing. So this is the first important result that sort of establishes redundancy in this entire discussion. We also looked at some of the regional networks and regional communities and their redundancies. We found that this change in age-associated age-associated change in redundancy was basically dominated by um, somatomotor lateral and dorsal networks, as well as the dorsal attention in the left, where I show that these networks had more than 50% nodes that showed strong association with age. And in the right, I showed that the location of these nodes and their ROIs, and I showed that they're uh, pretty diffusely present in the entire brain, but um, uh, mostly present along the motor network and the attention network. Next, we wanted to ask this question whether redundancy has an effect on age cognition. So we know that cognition worsens with age, and we would expect color word inhibition, for example, in verbal fluency to drop with age. But we wanted to see if this relationship was somehow mitigated by redundancy. So if redundancy is indeed brain reserve or some sort of brain reserve, it would be a good idea to test whether it is, for example, it has, for example, an effect on age cognition relationship in high redundancy subjects. So what we found was that uh, redundancy indeed mitigated age color word inhibition relationship in high redundancy subjects, which means that color word inhibition, for example, by the way, is a DCAF's subtest, which looks at subject's ability to switch and overcome inhibition in switching tasks. So what we found is that this color word inhibition generally worsens with age, but in subjects with high redundancy, the worsening is slower, significantly slower for the mitigation to be significant. We did not find any evidence for redundancy mediating age verbal fluency relationship. So redundancy does not seem to mediate the age verbal fluency relationship in the cohort that we looked at. So what are some of the takeaways? I think the central piece of this is that redundancy is an important substrate. It is a neural reserve that that is very much resembling the lifespan trend of brain reserve, and can be used as something that constitutes brain reserve. This is not a trivial metric because many other graph metrics do not, most other major graph metrics do not follow this dynamic and fail to follow this trend. Redundancy changes were dominated by dorsal attention motor networks, which mm, uh, seem to show that these networks are important as far as the brain reserve is concerned. Redundancy did mediate the H-CW relationship, showing that it indeed constitutes um, a mechanism of brain reserve, but it did not mitigate age-related worsening of verbal fluency. So, with those conclusions, I would like to leave it here, and then you can come to my Jitsi uh, meeting where we can discuss, and I will be happy to answer any questions. Um, I would offer you virtual donuts and whatnot. But looking forward to have a good discussion with you guys. Thank you.